carefully choreographed hostage exchanges between Israel and the armed resistance groups consisting of Hamas and Islamic Jihad in Gaza, the full scale of Gaza's devastation is finally sinking in. After more than a year of relentless Israeli airstrikes, backed militarily and diplomatically by the United States, entire neighborhoods have been reduced to rubble. Despite US support shielding Israel from diplomatic consequences, South Africa brought a case before the International Criminal Court, culminating into a historic ruling. The ICC issued arrest warrants for Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu and his defense minister Yoav Gallant on charges of war crimes, in addition to the one against the deceased Hamas commander Mohammed Daif. While this decision marks a significant moment in pursuit of international justice, Netanyahu is not the first sitting head of state to face an ICC indictment. That distinction belongs to Sudan's former president Omar al Bashir, who was charged with genocide and crimes against humanity during the Darfur conflict. Today, we turn our focus to Sudan. Since April 2023, Sudan has seen a continuing civil war that has not shown any signs of relenting, which has witnessed the displacement of millions, rampant gender based violence, and a health care crisis. Hello and Assalamu alaikum. My name is Sharjeel Usmani, and in this Polis project conversation, we'll try to unpack Sudan's ongoing conflict, the country's history, humanitarian crisis, which is, to quote UN Chief, of staggering scale and cruelty. We will also take a look at the geopolitical interests of UAE and other regional powers and Sudan's place in broader landscape of global justice or the lack thereof. To speak with me, we will be joined by Husam Mahjoub, who is a communications engineer by profession and the co-founder of Sudan Bukra TV, an independent and non-profit news organization founded back in 2019 as a media voice for the revolution. Husam also hosts a show on Sudan Bukra, where he provides critical analysis on the ongoing political developments in Sudan. Hello and welcome, Husam. It is a real pleasure to be talking to you.
Hello, Sharjeel. Thank you very much for the introduction. And it's a pleasure to be with you and with your audience. Thank you very much for having me.
So, Husam, let's begin with the man himself, Omar al Bashir. He was indicted by the ICC back in 2009 for allegedly directing a campaign of mass killing, rape, and pillage against civilians in Darfur. As I understand, the current conflict in Sudan has some roots in Darfur in the early 2000s, as the Rapid Support Forces or RSF's chief Hemeti was at the time the one doing bidding for Bashir in Darfur, which consequently led him to become what he is today. Or would that be a wrong assessment?
No, it's not a wrong assessment. It's actually very close to what happened, to the brief history of what happened in Darfur. The conflict for which Omar al Bashir was indicted in Darfur started in 2003, although it has roots in the that go back decades before. The conflicts in Darfur resembled conflicts in other parts of Sudan that had origin in issues related to natural resources, drought, and of course, the consequences of an unfinished liberation or independence. When Sudan, like many other African countries, we gained our independence back in January 1st, 1956. From the British Egyptian colonization, although the national governments that took over from the British and Egyptian colonization did not pursue development strategies and policies that cut that attempted to cut with the history of colonization. So they continued the history of marginalizing huge parts of the country and its people. So there have been different wars or conflicts in Sudan that started because the peoples of different parts of those different parts of Sudan attempted to have or to call for their rights, for right share of or equal share of development, services, and say in the rule of the country. However, because of various factors, some of these conflicts have transformed to become identity wars, like the famous one, the most famous one, the war between the South and the North, which has been labeled as a war between a Northern Arab Muslim majority against a minority of African Christians. This is a very simplified way to look at the conflict, but this is a way of transforming the conflicts to identity wars. This happened in Darfur again, as a consequence of droughts and other natural resources issues in the country that started from maybe the mid 20th century, but escalated in the 90s. In 2003, a rebel movement declared itself in Darfur and waged a war against the central government, Omar al-Bashir's government. The Actually, there were two main rebel movements: Sudan Liberation Movement, an army, and the Justice and Equity Movement. They started the war against the central government. Omar al-Bashir himself is a dictator who he was a military commander, military officer who took over the country's government by a coup against a democratically elected government back in 1989, and governed the country in a very brutal way. And the Darfur 2003 conflict was one of the landmarks of his rule. So the war started in 2003. Umar al-Bashir continued an unfortunate trend in the Sudanese modern state of the army basically deploying or recruiting local militias in to fight its war in the regions. The Sudanese army did this in the south and did it in Darfur. In Darfur, the militias that were recruited by the government to fight on its behalf were famously called Janjaweed. They committed mass atrocities against the civilians, not only the supporters or the soldiers, the fighters of the rebel movements, but the local populations of Darfur. They were called Janjaweed, and again, I hate to emphasize the ethnicity of the fighters, whether the Janjaweed or the movements, because again, as I started, it's not totally an ethnic conflict, but the majority of the Janjaweed were from the Arabs of Darfur, and the majority of the two rebel movements, were from the African tribes of Darfur. Um, Hemeti Muhammad Hamdan Dagalo was then one of the fighters. He wasn't the leader of the initial, like the first phase of Janjaweed. The leader then was Sheikh Musa Hilal, who was fighting besides the government. Muhammad Hamdan Dagalo emerged as one of the leaders, middle ranking leader of groups that fought with Musa Hilal besides the government. At certain time, he fought against the government himself, but then he rose to power with the support that he got from Umar al-Bashir and his intelligence service. And the second phase happened when he, with the support of al-Bashir, he controlled huge gold mines in Darfur, controlled the production of gold mines in an area called Jabal Amir, the mountain of Amir. And he toppled Musa Hilal. Musa Hilal fell with Umar al-Bashir, and he was jailed. And Hemeti emerged as the leader of what was later on called the Rapid Support Forces. It was decreed as a paramilitary force that reported directly to Umar al-Bashir as the president. And Umar al-Bashir used the Rapid Support Forces and Hemeti's fighters to as a parallel military force because he did not have full confidence on the Sudanese armed forces. So he kept playing the game of having the rapid support forces and under his command.
Let's begin with the most pressing issue that is in Sudan is the humanitarian crisis with over a million displaced and countless lives lost. It is the worst humanitarian crisis in the world. Can you describe the conditions on the ground, especially the areas hardest hit during the conflict?
Sure. Thank you, Sharjeel, for bringing this. Uh, Sudan is a huge country. Sudan, before the secession of the South, was the largest country area-wise in Africa. With the secession of South Sudan or the independence of South Sudan in 2011, the Republic of Sudan has become the third largest country in Africa, and it shares borders with seven countries: Egypt, Libya, Chad, Central African Republic, South Sudan, Ethiopia, Eritrea, and then it has a long coastline along the Red Sea. It The population of Sudan before the war started was around 50 million people. The war of the 15th of April that was started in April 15th, 2023. Um, Began in the capital Khartoum. Khartoum is by far the largest city in the country, with anywhere between 7 and 10 million people living in the state of Khartoum, which is composed of three main cities: Khartoum North, and Umdurman. But at the same time, the war also happened or started in other parts of Sudan, mainly Darfur, at the same time that it was waged in Khartoum. Because of the concentration of people in Khartoum, because of most of the military installations, military bodies, the military headquarters, and the headquarters of the different armed forces, because of the concentration of the population in Khartoum and the distribution of the military across the cities of Khartoum, the people of Khartoum suffered a lot from the heavy fighting at the first days or weeks of the war. And people had to flee Khartoum to other parts of Sudan and to neighboring countries. As you correctly said, it is now considered by by many as the largest humanitarian crisis in the world because of the sheer size of Sudan and its population. We have anywhere between 10 to 12 million people who have been forcibly displaced. About 8 million of them have been internally displaced inside Sudan to places other than their hometowns. More than 2 million, around 2.2 million people, refugees who fled to neighboring countries, the majority of whom fled to Chad in the west, Egypt in the north, and South Sudan in the south, plus tens of thousands of people to neighboring Ethiopia, Eritrea, Libya, and other countries. Uh, there are more than 25 million Sudanese, so more than half the population of Sudan are facing acute hunger. There are credible reports and declarations by international organizations that there are around more than 750,000 people who are on the brink of famine, and there are no accurate or even close to accurate numbers about the victims, the number of deaths. Definitely more than 20,000 deaths, but there are reports that put this number as high as 150,000. There was a recent report by the London School of Tropical Hygiene or Tropical Diseases and Hygiene. I think I'm not sure about the name, that estimated the number of deaths in the Khartoum state only by more than 60,000, more than 67,000. So the number of victims, civilian and military, seems to be in the hundreds of thousands of people. And that is the war spread to most of the states of Sudan. So it started in Khartoum, but it spread to the 5 states of Darfur, to most of the states of Kordofan in the south, the Jazeera, which is Jazeera and Sinnar, the White Nile, the Blue Nile in the south and central Sudan. The only states that have not been impacted as much as the others are the 2 states of the northern Sudan, the northern state and the Nile, the River Nile state, and the 3 states in the east, Gadarif, Kassala, and the Red Sea.
The sheer scale of the crisis there is it's difficult, painfully difficult to imagine. I just wanted to get you a real quick response on what are the humanitarian efforts there on the ground, and are they enough? And since especially since Trump came to power, he has stopped all the foreign aid for next 30 days, and it was one of the biggest aid providers to Sudan. What is the situation there now?
Well, again, thank you for the question. In fact, the response to the humanitarian crisis was, even before the recent decisions or executive orders by Trump, were in no way close to the real to covering any significant part of the needs of the Sudanese people, because of various reasons. The Sudanese people relied on themselves. They relied on grassroots structures that they built throughout the last few years, especially during the December 2018 revolution, the mass civilian mass protests against Omar al-Bashir that started in December 2018 and resulted in toppling him in April 2019, and continued specifically after the coup that was orchestrated by the 2 generals that are heading the 2 factions that are fighting today: General Burhan, the head of the Sudanese Armed Forces, and Himeti, the leader or the commander of the Rapid Support Forces. Both men orchestrated a coup against the transitional government that resulted from toppling al-Bashir and starting a transitional government in a setup that was meant to lead to national elections. The coup was in 2021. So the grassroots organized structures that the Sudanese people built, mainly young men and women, and were called revolutionary resistance committees, um, resisted the coup d'état of 20 October 2021 by the two generals. Um, During and continued to resist the coup. When the war started in April 2021, those structures, the resistance committees, transformed to what became known as emergency rooms. Emergency response rooms are grassroots structures spread across Sudan, composed from young men and women who live in the areas impacted by the war, that are providing basic services to the population, all services that you can think of: medical services, food, education, and even sharing, of course, information, especially at the first few weeks of the war, or when the war reaches an area. They provide safe paths, ways for the people who want to flee to safety. And these emergency rooms rely on donations and contributions of the Sudanese people, either both in Sudan and outside Sudan. So the diaspora, the Sudanese diaspora in various countries are contributing to alleviate the suffering of the Sudanese people. Of course, there have been throughout the past 2 years promises of foreign aid, international aid by different countries and international organizations. It's true that many of them contributed food supplies, medicine, um, and some health services, but they have not been to the level that is that matches the scale of the war. So I can say one of them that comes to mind is SAPA, Sudanese American Physician Association. It is an NGO established in the United States, but has presence on the ground in Sudan and is providing health services in and supporting hospitals on the ground and supporting medical staff in many parts of Sudan. So I would say that these are the two main bodies I think that are continuing to serve the Sudanese people as we speak.
All right, thank you for that. I Before I move on to the the actual war that is happening there, would you be able to contextualize it for us in the sense that a lot of the Western press is trying to seems to be too overly focused on making it an egotistical battle between two men who have stolen people's revolution. Is it that simplistic, or there are some nuances that the West is basically overlooking? And by West, I mean the major Western publications.
Again, Sharjeel, thank you. And I like the way you said that simplistic, because usually media tries to simplify complex things for people to understand. But a war as complicated and as complex as the one in Sudan cannot be simply uh, put as a conflict of power between two generals. This is the way that it had been positioned or presented at the beginning of the war. I think that the war is actually many wars inside one war. The result, of course, is the suffering for millions of Sudanese people, the destruction of the country and the state. Um, but it is more than one war. So there, when the war started, there were two major uh, armed forces in the country: the Sudanese armed forces, the National Army, that is now 100 years old, um, and that is older than the independent Sudan, and the Rapid Support Forces, which was officially um, created in less than 10 years ago, or I think it was created in 2013, so around 12 years ago. Um, so there was this tension between two armed forces. So this is definitely one reason, or one war there, between over resources, over control between the two forces, and by virtue of that, by between their two leaders. But this is only one aspect of it. There is another aspect of a war against the revolution, against the aspirations of the Sudanese people, who aspired to get rid of the dictatorship, the 30 years of dictatorship of Omar al-Bashir, and wanted to live in a country where they have the say on how it is run, and they took to the streets from December 2018 and continued throughout the until Omar al-Bashir was toppled, and after that. So the two factions, the armed forces, and specifically when I say the armed forces, I have to be very clear that I'm talking about its commanders, because the a lot of the file and ranks of this armed forces are normal Sudanese people who not necessarily have a say in what their commanders dictate. So the leadership of the armed forces and the leadership of the rapid support forces, both of them viewed the young men and women who took to the streets and who aspired to have a democratic government or a democratic system as a threat. So this is another aspect of the war. A third and important aspect of the war is a war between foreign powers on the over controlling Sudan, the resources of Sudan and the location of Sudan. And in this, we know that as I said, Sudan is a huge country that has a very important geostrategic location. It is rich with resources, not only gold and minerals, but agricultural lands and livestock. And this has put Sudan as a target for foreign powers. Regional powers, I may say that, emerging regional powers. So some of the countries that have been viewing the events of the December 2018 revolution and its aftermath with suspicion are the United Arab Emirates, Saudi Arabia, Egypt, Ethiopia. All have been, and of course, so behind them, the international major powers, the United States, European countries, Western European countries like France and the UK, and Russia, of course, plays a major role in the conflict in Sudan. So these are three main facets of the war.
The international community, all these major nations have sort of, for the longest time in the war, have shown passive or selective silence to hold RSF accountable, because it is not normal for a non-state actor to go on and commit a genocide without the world noticing and not doing anything about it, especially in a place where not one, multiple major powers are involved directly.
Yes, true. So many people say that label the war in Sudan as the forgotten war or the neglected war. Uh, so the selective silence against the war can be in Sudan can be attributed to many things. So one is that uh, it was basically competing for airwaves or airtime with the war in Ukraine and then the Israeli aggression, genocidal war against Palestine in Gaza. So with the Ukraine and Gaza, Sudan did not have did not find the amount of attention that it warranted. But I think another major point is, of course, there is always the international community's way of looking at wars in Africa. So basically, we cannot deny that there is an element of racism here. Let me put it blankly. They against well, this is they look to Africa and Africans as war is something normal. This is an ordinary thing that happens in Africa and committed by the African people. So it's nothing new. There is no news there. Um, but I think there is another major reason behind this selective silence, which is um, the the most, of course, the hegemon power in the world now, the United States, who has a lot of leverage on managing or on controlling, directing how things evolve in Sudan or in other parts of Africa by the sheer size of its its power and its resources, have in a way lifted its hands from direct hands from involvement in Sudan and in other parts of Africa, and delegated this to its allies. And I think here the main culprit is the United Arab Emirates. Um, I the United Arab Emirates is the country that is, although it's not the only foreign country that is involved in the war, but it is definitely the country that is most invested in the war. It has dedicated its resources, its PR machine, its relationships, and its lobbying powers in the United States and in the United Kingdom, basically um, to do what it wants in Sudan, while the U.S. Government and the U.K. government um, doing lip service at most when it comes to Sudan. It's not only that it is strange that a non-state player committing genocide in a country like Sudan and the international community doesn't take them or hold them accountable. It's actually during the first few months of the war, the leader of the RSF, Hemeti, was looked upon as a state person, as a statesman. He was um, welcomed in many important African countries, in Ethiopia, in Kenya, in Uganda, in South Africa, and in Djibouti, as a statesman. They He was uh, received by the presidents of these countries, and Rwanda also received and was treated VIP treatment. He was basically a president in the waiting. And this we know is because of his relationship with the UAE, and the UAE facilitated the diplomatic relationships and the logistics that allowed Hemeti to be viewed as a statesman, as a possible new leader for the Sudan after the war. The What we have seen the US and the UK and many Western European countries specifically doing is they basically weigh their interests with the United Arab Emirates and other countries, other allies, but mainly the UAE, and so they weigh this, and they weigh their the moral and the humanitarian aspects of the war in Sudan and the Sudanese people, the interests of the Sudanese people, and at the end of the day, they obviously decided to favor their relationships and interests with the UAE.
Thanks for that response, but I want to get into detail on UAE's involvement. But first, let's talk about General Burhan. He is largely seen as the de facto head of state and seems to have some support among civilians as well. But at the same time, uh, Hemeti's RSF did not have air force. SAF did under Burhan, and the indiscriminate bombing by SAF Air Force on civilians is something that's not largely picked up, talked about against RSF. No, now obviously US has sanctioned both Hemeti and Burhan, but how do you see Burhan's military aggression so far?
General Burhan is viewed by, at the beginning of the war, he was viewed by most of the Sudanese people, I would claim, as a criminal. He has blood on his hands. Um, People viewed him favorably on the first few days of when the armed forces toppled Omar al-Bashir at the end of the mass protest in 2019, so in April 2019. People viewed Burhan favorably as someone who um, managed to topple al-Bashir, and that they did not consider him as the one of the major cadres of the National Congress, the Congress, the ruling party of Umar al-Bashir. But immediately after that, Burhan continued. So the armed forces and um, other forces, security forces, and the rapid support forces continued committing crimes against the civilians, including committing a massacre on the 3rd of June 2019, where they killed more than 100 civilian protesters who were sitting in front of the military headquarters since April 2019, more than 2 months. So the Burhan was not able to, although he and Hemeti signed a power sharing agreement with the civilian power, the civilian parties that led to the establishment of a transitional government jointly between the army and the civilians. But the masses of the Sudanese people uh, were not in favor of Burhan, and because they specifically when he and Hemeti orchestrated the coup in 2021. When the war started, most of the people of Sudan the masses of the people of Sudan had this negative view of General Burhan. He, many people uh, accused him with the because many people in many civilians in Sudan relied on, or they were expecting the army to come to protect them against the attacks of the rapid support forces. So the failure of the army, specifically in the first phase of the war, the failure of the army to protect the civilians, and the falling of different cities and regions to the rapid support forces were all attributed to Burhan. So people accused him with either the lack of military expertise, the required expertise or command to stand against the rapid support forces, or that he, in part, and many people actually accuse him to be sidelining with the UAE at the end of the day. So that because and this is a part that is maybe very hard to fully understand, but despite the UAE being the main backer of the rapid support forces, the government of Sudan, the de facto government of Sudan under Al Burhan, who, as you correctly said, is the de facto president or leader of Sudan, is still relying on gold exports to UAE. So both the rapid support forces and Sudanese armed forces or de facto government are exporting or smuggling Sudanese gold to UAE, and then financing the war from the proceeds of this gold. And many um, uh, in addition to this, Al Burhan's failure or the army's failure to protect the civilians, the defeats of the army in many places, many cities, and many regions in Sudan, all are attributed or to Al Burhan, and then the bombardment and the atrocities that the army is committing against the civilians in many parts of Sudan are all Al Burhan's people are attributing them to Al Burhan. Although this picture has changed a lot in the last few months, with gains that the army has been the army has been gaining grounds and retaking some of the major cities and regions the rapid support forces occupied in the last in the first phase of the war. So uh, for many people, Burhan is now kind of the leader that is they rely on to have a chance of going back to their homes, which is, in my view, very sad, because unless he and the leadership of the armed support forces, as well as the leadership of rapid support forces, are held accountable for their atrocities, we will have no chance of having a lasting peace in Sudan when the war stops.
US has long used sanctions as a tool to influence political trajectory in various nations, including Sudan. It was widely known that Sudan was dropped from the terrorism list and was basically unsanctioned by the US for normalizing with Israel. How do you see the recent sanction by the US on Hemeti and his brother, and also Burhan? And why now? Why this late into into the war?
Um, I think the history of the U.S. sanctions across the world, not only in Sudan, but against all the countries that it has enforced these sanctions on, and we have a long history of U.S. sanctions, has shown that the sanctions are rarely inflicting damage to the regimes that are intended, that it intends to counter. But it actually, the sanctions actually cause more damage to the people than the regimes. We have seen this in many parts of the world, but we have seen it mostly in Sudan. So I would say that the sanctions on both Himeti and his brother Abdul Rahim, and like the other leaders of and their other brother Al Goni, the leaders of rapid support forces, as well as Al Burhan and other leaders of the army, are symbolic. Um, they, we have Umar al Bashir has been under, and his regime has been under sanctions for the most part of it, his 3 decades in power, and they could navigate well these embargoes and sanctions. And the Burhan and the de facto government, with the history the Sudanese state has, is able to find ways against these sanctions. But this doesn't mean that the sanctions are not important and they don't mean anything. Actually, they mean a lot, because in my view, one of the main results of the sanctions, specifically against Himeti and against Himeti, is damaging the prospects of having a government by the RSF, an RSF government. The RSF and many of its civilian allies were in the verge of forming. Actually, they are still claiming that they want to do that, to form a government in the areas controlled by the RSF, and that would have been something similar to the Libyan model, where you have two governments claiming sovereignty and claiming claiming that they represent the country. So and that would have been one step in the one additional step in the path of dismantling Sudan, and as we know it, and basically having two countries with. So with the sanctions against Himeti, the civilian forces that were ready or about to join him in forming that government realized that it is not politically wise to do so. So although there are still some civilians who are willing to go with him and to continue that endeavor, but many of the major forces will not. So, but other than this, I think it also causes, it will make things like the very the visits that Hemeti had to African nations in the beginning of 2024 and end of 2023, and being treated as a head of state it will make this harder. It will make very hard for many countries to continue supporting Hemeti the way they used to.
Yeah, let's turn our focus to UAE now. That's the most discussed country in the context of Sudan civil war, and for all the wrong reasons. There have been reports that UAE planes from UAE have been landing near RSF bases in the name of aid, and these planes reportedly are carrying weapons. And there were some pictures that that was reported, at least in our part of the world, that several RSF men were carrying Israeli-made weapons, and Hemeti also seems to have illegal trade deals with the government of UAE. What do you think are the vested geopolitical interests of UAE in this conflict, and to what extent is UAE invested in the Sudan conflict?
Yes, the UAE has interests, geostrategic and economic and security interests in the African region, in the African continent. It's actually not only Africa, so it has interests in its neighborhood, in the Middle East, in Southeast Asia, and in Africa. And it I I think the one way to look at what the UAE is doing in its neighborhood is considering it a sub-imperial power. So sub-imperialism is a concept that has emerged in the 1960s by a Brazilian Marxist scholar, an activist, and his name is Roy Mauro Marini, and it basically I think it can be applied fully to the UAE, where the UAE relies on the United States for the UAE's government and regime rely on the US for its support and existence. So it is not fully imperial because it relies on an imperial power, and it works in tandem and in harmony with that imperial power, the US. But it is imposing, and it imposes um, uh, it, uh, it it imposes its own view, and it yeah, within its sphere of influence. So it has its own independent agendas, and in its sphere of influence, and it pursues these interests. So that kind of explains what the UAE's role in Africa. And I would say that in Africa, the UAE's interest, and those are fully we can see them in Sudan. The UAE wants economic hegemony. It wants political influence and control, and it's so and it can do this by gaining access and control over resources, natural resources, mineral resources, agricultural lands, and other economic resources, as well as the political influence by being a kingmaker, changing regimes, having influencing the politics of the region, and interfering in the uh, uh, conflicts of the region. The third aspect of the UAE's strategy in the region is uh, it's it's the way it perceives democratic governments and experiments in the region as a threat to its regime, its influence, its regime, and its power. So the UAE looks to each government, each democratic transformation or revolution or democratic system in its neighborhood as something that can inspire its people to revolt against the UAE's regime, and this is why it does not tolerate any democratic aspirations for the region. We have seen this in the UAE's response to the Arab Spring, in all the Arab Spring countries, and we are seeing it very clearly in Sudan. So this UAE had the UAE has great interest, economic interest in Sudan. It has agricultural lands. It has investments in the gold mines and in minerals. It has interests and in ports on the Red Sea. But it could have had these interests, secured these interests with good relationships with the political actors without resorting to this war. So this is one aspect. The other aspect of the political influence and political hegemony is also by it interfering in the politics of Sudan, and it had done this throughout the last more than 12, 13 years. It supported Omar al-Bashir, although the UAE had very bad relationships for the most part of his 3 decades in power, but the relationships were amended when Omar al-Bashir accepted to send Sudanese soldiers from the Rapid Support Forces as well as the Sudanese Armed Forces to fight besides UAE and Yemen in UAE and Saudi Arabia in Yemen. So for the last few years of Umar al-Bashir, the UAE has backed him and has supported him financially. But when they realized that the people could no longer live with al-Bashir, they started trying to influence the regime that followed Umar al-Bashir. So these two aspects, the political and economic hegemony, are very clear in Sudan. The third one, of course, is to work against the democratic aspirations, and I think this justifies, or this can explain the brutality of this war. The war is meant against the Sudanese state. So the war has the Rapid Support Forces, when it attacked the institutions of the state of Sudan, they attacked the history of the state of Sudan. They attacked the museums. They attacked the national registration, the archives, the national archives, and it will take, so the way the UAE, I think, has looked into this, whether they planned it before or just supported it as it happened. They basically are showing the UAE people and the people of the region that, well, if you want democracy, if you want revolution, you have the example of Sudan. You had the example of Syria. You had the example of Iraq. You had the example of Yemen. So you can have this if you wanted democracy, or you forget about democracy and then live with whatever dictator that we bring you, with whatever puppet that we put in power. And I think this explains why the UAE is invested in the war. It is invested, and the second part of your question, how it is the UAE is invested. The UAE is the main. So the Rapid Support Forces is main hub for finance, logistics, PR is in the UAE. I think the UAE is not financing the war from its own pockets. It's actually financing the war from the proceeds of the Sudanese gold and the Sudanese livestock and whatever that is imported from Sudan to the UAE or smuggled to the UAE, and it is providing providing weapons from different manufacturers to the rapid support forces through covert operations that included many of the countries, African countries that we talked about, but mainly Chad. So Kenya, they include Kenya, Uganda, Rwanda, Ethiopia, but they logistically, because and Libya and Haftar militia, who are the Haftar militia is an ally of the UAE, just like the rapid support forces. And the Wagner militia, the Russian militia, at the beginning of the war, had before the Russian government assassinated its leader. They all participated in the covert operations of smuggling weapons to rapid support forces. And since you mentioned earlier that the Sudanese armed forces has the air forces, it has fighter jets that the rapid support forces doesn't have. Um, Actually, one of the changes that happened in this war, that we witnessed in this war, is the emergence of the use of drones by both, actually, the rapid support forces and the Sudanese armed forces. But there have been many credible reports of the UAE providing the drones to rapid support forces, and with that, the RSF was able to wage wars and attacks against not only civilian population but even infrastructure, the infrastructure of Sudan, like such as electricity and power stations and dams, some of the dams in Sudan.
This many nations' involvement in any country's politics and development is actually a bad sign. We have seen what has happened in Syria, beginning from 2011 and so on, and what it led to. So, do you see any realistic prospect of negotiated settlement or war ending with either of the two parties surrendering? That is especially discussed now after the recent victories of SAF in Khartoum and some other areas in Sudan. How do you see this conflict ending?
Yeah. So I think there are always possibilities of reaching a peace treaty or to end the hostilities and ceasefire. We have done that before in many of our wars. Whether this means a lasting peace, that's a different question. And I think so. Let me my unfortunately, my view is that a lasting peace is something we're very far away from, and it will take Sudan a few more decades until we are able to restore or to have a lasting peace and build a nation that is able to include all its people. But seizing the hostilities now and reaching an end to the active fighting can happen. I There have been, the Jeddah Forum was one, but during the height of the RSF victories and defeats to the Sudanese armed forces at the end of 2023 and beginning of 2024, people realized a few weeks after that, in January 2024, that there were actually secret negotiations between the leaders of the RSF and SAF in Bahrain, including including Saudi Arabia and the US, who are the facilitators of Jeddah Forum, but including also Egypt and UAE, with the understanding that UAE is the main backer of the RSF and Egypt is the main backer of the Sudanese armed forces. So the negotiations that fell apart at the last minute in January 2024 are an indicator that there might be negotiations happening somewhere, sometime, that can at one point lead to a resolution. This can happen, and I think with the victories that the armed forces are gaining now, it might be either. So, first of all, there can be each of the two parties thinks or seems to declares that they can win militarily. I think that even if the one of them wins or takes most parts or most important parts of cities and towns of Sudan, the war itself would not end because there are so many militias now, specifically under the RSF. The RSF, although itself a militia, has become a militia of militias. There are so many factions that are fighting, and basically the RSF has lost the command and control over over these groups. So, but so I think that, yeah, the supporters of the army are think that the army is very close to regaining Khartoum, the capital, and retaking Khartoum, and retake this. If they are able to retake Khartoum, this means that they have regained or all most of the parts in northern, central, eastern, and southern Sudan that the RSF occupied in the first phase of the war. It remains only Darfur, which is under the most of Darfur is under the control of the RSF, with a siege that it has on Al Fashir, which is the last remaining stronghold of the army in Darfur. So. Some people would like to think that a military victory means that this is the end of the war. The army will take will defeat the RSF, and that's the end of it. I think more realistically, it might be negotiations between the two, uh, um, and the negotiations can happen now when or either maybe they are happening now with the RSF, where the army has the upper hand on the ground, and we've seen indications for negotiations, secret negotiations in January, December, and January, when there was a deal reached between the government of South Sudan and the de facto government of Sudan for allowing the oil of South Sudan to be exported through the pipeline that crosses Sudan to the Red Sea, through the port of Sudan. And some of the areas that the pipeline passes by are under the control of the RSF. Some of the most of it is under the control of SAF. So the fact that such a deal has been reached means that there was some maybe indirect negotiations between RSF and SAF and the government of South Sudan. People realize that most wars end with negotiations. The thing now is maybe the negotiations will happen with the army having the upper hand.
Well, thank you, Husam. I just have one question, and it is a bit of cliche, but still an important question. And that is, if you could send a message to the international community about Sudan, what would it be?
No, it's not. It's not cliche. Thank you very much. It's actually my message is let let the Sudanese people determine their fate. But so let us decide how we want uh, to 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 end this war, and how we want to with the type of peace that we want to have, and the system that we want to achieve. But in order to do this, uh, the international community must um, pressure the the parties that the international community is supporting, and to pressure them to stop the war. So basically, my view is that unless the international community pressures countries like the UAE, who is providing weapons to the rapid support forces, there is no chance of stopping the war. And this is something the Sudanese people is so we can handle our things, we can handle our internal things. We need to have the space to handle our internal matters, but with the heavy hand of the international community favoring one party, supporting one party as criminal as the RSF, there is no chance of achieving this peace. So the international community should do all what is needed to uh, to stop the pouring of weapons to Sudan, to give it a chance to achieve peace. Of course, we need assistance. We need the support of the international community for the millions and hundreds of thousands of refugees and tens of thousands of refugees in neighboring countries and the internally displaced in Sudan. And yeah, that's all what I can say. Yeah, thank you, and spread like do what you're doing, Sharjeel. I think one main thing actually. So that's the international community, the governments and organizations. But my message to the people and to the media, to the activists, is to support, to know, to be informed about what's happening in Sudan. It's it's a struggle. The Sudanese people's struggle is part and parcel of the struggle of all the peoples in the world. We share the same values, and we need to stand in solidarity with each other. So, yeah, thank you for all what you're doing.
Thank you, Husam. Thank you for your time and those detailed responses. I hope to talk to you again in a better time and on a better topic, hopefully, very soon. Jazakallah khair for talking to us.
Inshallah. Thank you very much, Sharjeel. Thank you very much for your time. Again, I thank you because I know I talk a lot. I really thank your interest and thank you for reaching out to me. And inshallah, we talk and keep in touch. And again, inshallah, in better topics, inshallah. Thank you so much. Thank you.